लेडीज एंड जेंटलमैन, और आपको बहुत बहुत शुक्रिया मैं यहाँ बुलाने के लिए। इतना शानदार और अनडिजर्विंग इंट्रोडक्शन जो मुझे दिया गया था वो इस वजह से है कि मैंने खुद लिखा है उसे। तो जब मैं दिल्ली से चला आज सुबह तो मैं इंग्लिश में प्रेजेंटेशन देने वाला था। जब यहाँ पहुँचा पूना में तो हिंदी बन गया था, और शाम को जब मैं यहाँ पहुँचा तो आई वाज बीइंग आस्क्ड कि आप मराठी में बोल सकते हो या नहीं। तो आई थिंक इंग्लिश और हिंदी को मिक्स करके आई विल डू माय बेस्ट। सो टुडे आई विल टॉक अबाउट इंडियाज मोस्ट, इन माय ओपिनियन, मोस्ट सीरियस सिक्योरिटी कंसर्न। मुझे सब्जेक्ट जो है पाकिस्तान दिया गया था, लेकिन इट इज़ ऑल्सो ट्रू that what happens with China is affecting what happens with Pakistan so the subject will be the sort of nettlesome boundary question of the Sino-Indian boundary. Now, why am I qualified to give this lecture? I can only think of one reason. The Sino-Indian dispute officially began with a letter that Chow En-lai wrote to Nehru, where he said that for the first time they acknowledged, China was acknowledging at a very high level that there is a boundary dispute. उससे पहले वो कह देते थे कि भाई पुराने मैप्स हैं, वो गलत मार्क था मैप पे, we have no boundary question and so on. नेहरू को टरका देते थे Chow En-lai. This was the first time that he actually wrote a letter saying we have boundary disputes on several areas and we need to resolve them. That letter was written on the 23rd of January 1959, and that is also the day that I was born. So I consider myself having a very good grasp of the Sino-Indian boundary, where we share the same birthday. People commonly talk about the unsettled border between India and China as a boundary dispute, but it is actually much more than that. It is a territorial dispute over 130,000 square kilometers of land. That's a state, that's about the size of the state of Tamil Nadu. So I've made some slides that might be of use in understanding the locations and so on. There are three real sort of sectors, as it were, where the dispute exists. You have the western sector, जहाँ पे ऊपर अक्साई चिन जहाँ पे लिखा हुआ है, the central sector, which is those two red dots that you see on Uttarakhand and Himachal Pradesh's border with China, and then you have that big red mark on the right hand side, which is the state of Arunachal Pradesh. I will sort of mention one point that is sort of always very interesting in both its effect and China is supposed to be very good at hybrid warfare, which includes interfering with lectures that they want to do. I should also tell you one incident that took place. We had gone for a track 2 meeting with Pakistan into Lahore. Indian side was all Faujis in a couple of national security people. Pakistan was all security and Maliha Lodhi was their head. So one of our generals thought that he must make a high impact beginning, and he started off with the same statement that was made over here, that you can choose your what is it? You can choose your friends, but you cannot choose your neighbors. This man gets up, one of our generals, he says, you can choose your friends, but you cannot choose your enemies. So, it has completely fizzled out the whole impact of that statement. Anyway, so we have the three sectors, and for China, Aksai Chin came to have major strategic value after the communist government built the strategic Western Highway. Can we have the next slide? Okay, Western Highway through this area, which connects Tibet with Xinjiang. Prior to the 1950s, I should also sort of give you an idea of the terrain for which I have chosen this photograph. The valley floors are around 9, 10, maybe 11,000 feet, and then from there these mountains rise, which go up to as much as 18,000 feet, 19,000 feet in some cases. What does this mean for military operations and for people who are operating there? It means, first of all, that you're always short of oxygen. You can't run, you can't this thing, and everything depends on how well you acclimatize. If you have not acclimatized well, you will not be able to operate at the heights at which you're expected to, which is why the army has one of the most scientific and best conceived acclimatization methods that equip them for operating at these heights. It is not just the Fauji Jawans who have a problem operating at heights. Vehicles, tanks, all kinds of equipment that require air, because when they require air, what they actually require is the oxygen in the air, and that is in short supply as you go higher and higher. That is the Indus River, and I've chosen it because it debunks one of the popular myths. You would remember that when you were in school, at least when I was in school, they always said that the Indian frontier is protected by the natural barrier of the Himalayas. The whole of Ladakh is across the Himalayas. It's the other side. It's not in the sort of conceptualized version of India where you are protected by the Himalayas. So you have the Himalayas, and then you have Ladakh, which is actually a part of the Tibetan plateau. And that is one of the vulnerabilities that China ascribes to it, because they have, just the Western Highway that I was coming to, and they feel that India has a good springboard for attacking and capturing that highway. It may be a bit paranoid on the part of the Chinese, but that's one of the things. So, can we have the next map? Yeah. So, for China, Aksai Chin came to have major strategic value after the government built a road called the Western Highway, which connects Tibet with Xinjiang. Prior to the 1950s, the only the only road that really connected the rest of China, or mainland China, or Han China, if we choose to call it that way, with Tibet, ran along. There's a place called Chengdu here. This is the province of Sichuan. And when the Red Army invaded Tibet in 1950, they came along this road, which was the only road that was actually viable at that time. There was, the Red Army's Southwestern Command took this route, moving into Lhasa in the summer of 1951. Meanwhile, there's a road from here. There was a very, very poor road which was used by the Northwest Command. They had a general who was one of those legendary Chinese Red Army generals called Fan Ming. He came down this road. He took his sort of troops and so on, and it took him 8 months extra to reach Tibet compared to the Southwestern Command that had taken place, that had taken this route. Now from this area, it was felt necessary to build a road that goes this way. The red stuff that you can see, this red blotch is the Aksai Chin, and it goes straight through the Aksai Chin. India, which claimed the Aksai Chin, found out about this road when it was announced in the Chinese press. So, as the Chinese would tell our diplomats, this really doesn't sound like your territory. If we could build a road through it, without your getting to know, then that's it. But anyway, this was the Western Highway. Its number is G219. When the Chinese talk about it, they talk about Highway G219. And that is one of the vulnerabilities. This is the area of Daulat Beg Oldie, and they feel that the Indian troops could just cut across this area and reach our Western Highway, and we would be in a bad way. Next, please. This is what it looks like from close up. This is the Karakoram Pass here, the northernmost tip of India, and this is Daulat Beg Oldie, and this is sort of the route going down. All the Chinese incursions that took place in 2020 were into this area, except for some which were here at the Pangong Tso Lake. Anyway, Nehru realized, and we all curse Nehru for his alleged mishandling of both the UN aspect of Kashmir and the China, but he was constantly trying to downplay the importance of these areas, because the right wing of his own party, the Congress party, had everything. There was no opposition in those days. It had a left wing, it had a right wing, it had a socialist party, it had everything. And people like Rajendra Prasad, Govind Ballabh Pant, Mahavir Tyagi, and so on, giants among men, they were all right wing, where politically placed where the BJP is about right now. So Nehru told Parliament when he was writing down the value, he says, and I'm quoting directly, "This is not worth anything. No tree grows anywhere in this wide area. There may be some shrubs." And next, please. This was Nehru with this thing. Next, please. That's Mahavir Tyagi. Mahavir Tyagi pointed to his head and said, "No hair grows on my head. Does it mean that my head has no value?" This is taken direct from the Lok Sabha debates. So next, please. So Kashmir is highly divided. We think about it as caught between India and Pakistan, but look at the number of areas where it's sort of in a different color. This is the Shaksgam Valley. This was presented by Pakistan to China in 1963, subject to the resolution of the Kashmir dispute at a later place. So this is not with the owners who should be owning it. This yellow patch here, mustard colored, is the Siachen Glacier. This was also without an identity until India did the sensible thing and went and sent troops over it, and it's now in India's possession. What we call Pakistan occupied Kashmir is in Pakistan's books two different areas. One is the Gilgit-Baltistan area, which used to be called the northern areas first, and the other is Azad Kashmir, which joined together, and we call that POK. Then you have Aksai Chin, also administered by China. They've reached somewhere around here now in terms of permanent possession, and this goes down to an area here called Demchok near the Himalayan border. So you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and let's not forget 6. 6 owners of the same place, which everyone says is not India's. Besides Aksai Chin, there's also a dispute I had mentioned of Demchok. This is about 500 square kilometers. Chinese claims in this sector increased between December 2000 and December 59 and 2000. And then there was a sort of a major sort of reckoning taken when a bunch of Chinese diplomats were invited to India, and then they had the diplomatic sort of examination from diplomats from both sides of the claims of the respective partners. the Chinese managed to sort of increase their claim line even further during this period. In the 1962 war, China physically occupied the territory that they had claimed in 1960 and 1959, including along the two lakes over here, the Spangur and the Pangong lakes, the Chipchap Valley, the Galwan River Valley, and then finally around Demchok, which we talked about. So China still continues its occupation of these areas, amounting to some 3,000 square kilometers. And if you add the Shaksgam Valley to this also, it comes to 44,000 square kilometers that India has allowed to go to various people who should not be there. 5,180 square kilometers is the Shaksgam Valley. Then next please. This is next is the central sector, which mainly consists of Baraoti, which is a gap in the Himalayan wall, and you know there's a sort of plain on the other side. It's called the Baraoti plain. China can sort of have an easy access across the Himalayas at this one place over here. So that's 2,000 square kilometers. Most of it is not really useful for even for China, and left to themselves, if we can find a way of reconciling the Arunachal and the Ladakh claims, the central thing is not something that will come in the way of a settlement. Next please. This is made in this manner, this map, just to show you how sort of isolated Arunachal is, number one, and number two, how big it is actually as a part of India. So this is the sort of major portion of the dispute, the border of Arunachal Pradesh and Tibet, where India claims that the border runs along the McMahon line. McMahon was the gentleman who drew up the border. He didn't do a very good job of it, because when they went out onto the ground and tried to see it, there were all kinds of places where the watershed was not the border, and it had been agreed that the border would be made to run along the watershed line. So McMahon line is the frontier in Arunachal Pradesh, but it is not the frontier anywhere else. This part is called the frontier is just the line of actual control, the LAC. And you know, it's a common mistake that people make, calling the whole boundary the McMahon line. It's not so. It's only the boundary between Arunachal Pradesh and Tibet. Can we have the next slide, please? Now this is the Arunachal map. Arunachal was not always Arunachal. It used to be until about 72. It used to be the Northeast Frontier Agency, or NIFA. And it got its name, India first. We were in the business of aggravating China in those days. First we called it Arunachal Pradesh, it made it a union territory, and then at the time of the Sumdorongchu crisis, we wanted to finger the Chinese even further, so we gave it statehood and said this is Arunachal state. China's claim here is ambiguous. It's not a very clear claim. It claims that the dispute is over 90,000 square kilometers, but the whole of Arunachal Pradesh, which Chinese maps show, is just 65,000 kilometers. It's unclear where these missing 25,000 kilometers are, but I'm sure the Chinese will have some answer. Then next please. The most contentious part of this claim relates to the district of West Kameng and Tawang, which is a town. It's a very beautiful town, I have to say, that is right on the tip, the eastern tip of Arunachal Pradesh almost, and is the home of this very revered monastery, which in Gelug Buddhism is one of the most important monasteries in this area. Tawang also has many other reasons that make China worry about it radiating its Buddhist influence across the boundary. and one of them is that the sixth Dalai Lama was born in Tawang. This was all part of Buddhist politics at that time. The Dalai Lama of that time, who was the fifth Dalai Lama, he sent somebody to take over the monastery and enhance Gelug sort of heft. And not having succeeded entirely in doing it, he said, well, let's identify a Dalai Lama from this area. Now, Dalai Lamas had always been identified there. It's identified as a reincarnation. And they had always sort of said that the reincarnation is in Tibet. But this was the Dalai Lama in a little village down below called Urjiling, who is a sort of a Tawang-based Dalai Lama. The only other example of this happening was when they identified one Dalai Lama belonging to Mongolia, and that coincidentally was when they were trying to take over Mongolia as a thing. So one of the sort of good ways of doing it is to make it firstly a Buddhist-friendly country by identifying a Dalai Lama from there, and then you take it on from there. Then there is one little stretch over here, this thing that's marked in red, that is actually neither the line of actual control nor is it NIFA. This is the border between Sikkim and China. It's 220 kilometers in extent, and this is the only agreed border that exists between India and China. The rest of the 4,588 kilometers of border are all disputed in one way or the other. But we got Sikkim through annexation. We just sort of took it over one day, and we got a 220 kilometer agreed border for free along with it. Now let's just take a quick look at how this territorial dispute originated. Next, please. This is the sort of border between Arunachal Pradesh and China. This is one of the very scenic spots along the border. It's a mountain called Kaito, and this is Gaurichen. Give the next slide. Very sort of prized mountain to climb amongst mountaineers, and the Indian Army has also been up on top at least 3 or 4 times. So this was the border that separated India from China for thousands of years, and sort of it only changed or became something that had to be something desirable in territorial terms when sort of Russia started creeping southwards, and then the Great Game began. The Great Game was, as its name would suggest, it was a game that involved taking over territory so that the other, Russia in the case of the UK and UK in the case of the Russia, so that they don't come into contact with one another and have a sort of contest for control of this territory. So Britain felt the need to sort of take over this area, or to sort of put it in favorable terms. And next, please. So they convened the Simla Conference and said, we'll have one representative from each country. Sir Henry Ratcliffe, what's his name? Mr. McMahon from the British side. The Longchen Shatra, who's a senior Tibetan minister from their side, and Ifan Chen, who was the Chinese sort of representative. They came, and Britain told them very flat, can we have the next slide, that this is meant not for delineating the border with India, it's meant for delineating the border with inner Tibet and outer Tibet. Because Britain had its eyes on this area as well. So they had a sort of months and months of negotiation, literally, sitting in a very lovely sort of building in Simla. And they came up with these maps where this is the outer Tibet boundary, this is the inner Tibet boundary. Can we go further up with the next slide, please? These are the seals that took place, And the reason why I'm showing you all these seals is because China eventually said that we do not agree to the border that you signed up, and the representative refused to sign. They sent it to Beijing. Everybody in Beijing refused to sign. So we have the McMahon Line boundary, which is agreed to by India and Tibet. China says Tibet has not got no locus standi to sign on the boundary. So 2 out of 3 are a little dodgy when it comes to the McMahon Line. Next, please. This is the part of the McMahon Line that is in Tawang, opposite Tawang, flows into the Bhutan border, and this is also under dispute in many ways. So many ways that it's probably not worth going into them. So these were the 2 maps which came out of the Simla conference, except that China refused to sign any of them, and that it to this date says that that was a colonial imposition, and we will not accept that this is the McMahon Line. Copies of this map were exchanged only between the British and the Tibetan plenipotentiaries, and a formal exchange of letters took place on 25th March 1914. Next, please. This is McMahon Line close up. So the interesting part over here is that the Tibetans continued to exert control over Tawang. It was a totally colonial relationship because Tawang was this very rich area. It's got beautiful fields, grows vegetables, grows rice, grows all kinds of things. And the Chinese said that, or the Tibetans, said that you all come under this monastery over here, a place called Sona, and you have to pay us tribute. So every year, hordes of people with tribute on their heads would be sent by the people, the ecclesiastical, the religious leaders of Tibet who were in Tawang, and that tribute used to go to the monasteries on top. So, if you travel to Tawang, you will notice a discernible dislike amongst the local Monpa tribals. Firstly, for the Chinese, that in any case they dislike. Practically everyone in Arunachal hates the Chinese for what they did to the monasteries and so on in Lhasa when they invaded. But they also dislike the Tibetans as well, the Indian Monpas, for the simple reason that Tibet continued its occupation of Tawang. Even after everything else had happened. India had got independence in 47, and up till 1951, Tibet was continued to rule this part of the country. So there was a quick expedition launched by one of India's unknown heroes, a person called senior moment called Major Kathing. He was a bit ironical because he was a Naga, which was itself fighting for independence against India, but he went and he got the Tawang Bowl for India and administered it very successfully for long enough. Next, please. Britain, having negotiated all these things and done all kinds of hera-pheri in terms of signatures and so on, then forgot about it, because that happened in 1914, and the same year the First World War began, and that was sort of the cream of British youth was sacrificed during that war. The cream of French youth, the cream of German youth. It was just a very destructive war. So no talk took place about the Simla conference and about taking over control of Tawang. Next, please. So the elephant was at loggerheads with the dragon because the boundaries just didn't match. There was, at the time of independence, no clear boundary in Ladakh. There was no clear boundary in Uttarakhand. Simla was not a part of India at all. and there was no clear boundary in Arunachal Pradesh. So it was only in 1936 that Britain was persuaded to publish the full texts of the 1914 convention, and it was in 1937 for the first time that Survey of India maps showed the McMahon line as the official boundary between Nepal and Tibet. But it was still left to independent India to actually implement this on the ground, and we are still implementing. Okay, so given this, the complete mix-up and the complete ambiguity around the borders, a territorial dispute between India and China was inevitable. There was never any way this was not going to happen. Both two sort of Asian powers, both emerging from extended periods of domination by foreign powers, and both acutely conscious of their civilizational heritage and their political sort of reach and power. None of them were going to sort of compromise on what they perceived as rightfully theirs. Next, please. And then it became even more messy with China's invasion of Tibet. This is the Red Army staging a flag march across the country. That's the Potala Palace, the Dalai Lama's palace in the background. Next, please. And what did it lead to? It led to the Dalai Lama deciding to escape his Khampa bodyguards, and he formed a sort of column, and in a very sort of well-planned way, they walked for about 14 days, or if I remember the figure correctly, from Lhasa to the border near Tawang, at a sort of little border post called Zimintang, and entered India, where, surprise, surprise, there was an Indian official waiting for him over there. So he was then put into a jeep and carried away, and then he asked for sort of accommodation and sort of space for eventually something like 50 to 60,000 Tibetans eventually came in through these routes, and they were all settled partly in Dharamshala, partly in near Karnataka. There is a lot of Tibetan settlements. To this date, they don't have official citizenship of India, but don't let that fool you. The Indian military runs 4 battalions of very fine Tibetan troops, which is called the Special Frontier Force. And one of the, practically the only sort of feature that we captured back from the Chinese in the Pangong Lake sector was mainly spearheaded by Tibetan troops of the Special Frontier Force. You can't go and repeat any of this. Making matters worse was that India granted the Dalai Lama asylum and sort of said, now we've got the Dalai Lama, now we absolutely don't have to negotiate with the Chinese any longer. The 1962 war was China's answer, and it was a humiliating Chinese victory. So let's go on from post 62. 62 is just too sad a story for me to tell. Everybody knows it anyway. And for 20 years after that sort of war, the hangover of the defeat was so intense within the Indian army that they said, we will not go across near the border at all. For example, in the Tawang area, the Sela sort of massif was the first defensive line of India, leaving the whole of the Tawang Bowl and the whole of the Tawang sort of forward zone, if I may call it that, untended. There would be sort of long-range patrols that went from Sela to there, and the same situation was in Ladakh as well. But eventually, General Krishna Rao, who was one of our very fine chiefs, he went to Indira Gandhi and he said, I can't be a chief like this who is leaving a large sum of land for the Chinese. We don't even try to take it back. So he convinced Indira Gandhi to sort of take back that land, and then gradually a sort of forward creeping of the Indian army took place, and they started going back towards the border. So during this whole period of 20 years, India had some fairly sort of good moments, if I may call it that. The 1967 Nathula clash, where the Sikkim border with Tibet, the Chinese sort of opened fire one day at a sort of Indian soldiers working party that was putting up a fence, caused a lot of casualties, killed a bunch of guys, and that led to the Indian side going full pelt at the Chinese, and they really sort of came out very well from that clash. The Indian army got the better of the PLA. So next, this is Zhou Enlai, China's finest diplomat in its history. All these years, Zhou Enlai was still in dialogue with the Indian leadership, and he was saying from 1956 onwards until 1982, the Chinese were saying, let's have a deal. We'll give you Arunachal Pradesh or Nifa, you give us Ladakh, and we will sort of find a way for that middle sector. Nobody cared about the middle sector anyway. So this was repeatedly offered to India, and India repeatedly said, no question, this is all our land and we will keep it ourselves. Today, if some Chinese diplomat was to make this offer, the Indian side would bite his hand off, and will be so happy to take it. But China continued signaling that it was ready for a settlement along the lines that Zhou Enlai had proposed, and in 82, next please. This is Deng Xiaoping from his height of 5 feet 1 looking down at Rajiv Gandhi, who's 5 feet 10. Only the Chinese can do this. He sort of, one of the first things he told Rajiv Gandhi, you look very young. So, Rajiv was already on the back foot after that. No, I'm not young, I'm actually very sick. So, Deng Xiaoping in 1982 gave an interview repeating the sort of East for West settlement, and in 1983, this is a very interesting question, what happened between 82 and 83? He said that India will have to make concessions in the West, in the East as well, which means Tawang. Then in 85, for the first time, China explicitly demanded that India hand over Tawang in Arunachal Pradesh as an indispensable component of a settlement. So this India was not going to do. General Krishna Rao and Indira Gandhi sort of ordered a forward posture, except that this time, unlike in the 1950s when we were going up without any rations, without any clothing, without any sort of necessities needed for survival in those areas, this was a very well planned and very well mobilized advance to the border, and at the end of it didn't last very long. 3 years later, in 1986, the Chinese occupied a sort of a grazing ground called Wangdong across a nala called the Sumderongchu, and it almost led to war again. So this eventually led to, can we go back? We are still here. This led to Rajiv Gandhi going to Beijing, meeting Deng Xiaoping, and it was by and large decided that, forget all the previous offers. We will set up a sort of joint working group. We have joint working groups with almost every country. Joint working groups that will take up the task of clarifying the alignment of the LAC. Now, while this was going on, China was actually playing it very sensible. They said, and I'm assuming here, nobody told me about this. They said to each other that we cannot allow, if we're not making a settlement with the border, we should not allow any incident that takes place to result in a renewal of fighting between India and China, because this 1962 war has gone very badly for us. They had made a sort of virulent enemy in India, and a lot of the Western powers also came down on the India side. So he said, we don't want another war with India. We will put in place a network of agreements that will ensure that no war takes place. First one, please. This is the 1993 Agreement on Peace and Tranquility. It's called the Peace and Tranquility Agreement. It's regarded as the mother agreement of all Indian settlements and border treaties. Treaties is a very big word. I should say agreements and conventions that were settled. Next, please. There was then an agreement on confidence building measures in the military field. This was 3 years later in 1996, and both these treaties or agreements actually had one very sensible component, and that was that we need to exchange maps of what we regard as the border and what you regard as the border. Only then will we know what we disagree on. But amazingly, it has not yet been changed. We still don't know what the disagreement is. But that was 96, and one expected them to be more pushy in this matter. Next, please. In April 2005, there were modalities for implementation of confidence building measures. This meant that if two patrols came into contact with each other, and patrolling was continued by both sides in any case, because you exercise your right to a place by sending troops and patrols and making it clear that it's your place. So what happens when the platoons come face to face? There was a full drill that was worked out, where one side would take out this banner and have one guy hold that side, one guy hold this side, and would say, go away, this is our country and our territory. And then the other side would unfurl their banner and say, no, this is our territory. And then after this unfurling of banners took place, they were then supposed to assume that they had finished their patrol and go back to where they came from. The patrol also is, interestingly, I don't know why we do these things. The Chinese come and they leave packets of cigarettes and so on. And in some cases, they've been known to leave full packets of cigarettes so that the Indian side can even have a smoke. But what were we leading? In many cases, we would leave a biscuit packet that had "Made in China" written at the bottom. So Chinese economic power was at work on the line of actual control as well. Next, please. Okay, so I've made a bit of a jump over here. In the meanwhile, what happened? India started getting into the US sphere of influence. In 2004, when the tsunami took place, the Indian Navy did an absolutely magnificent job. They were spanning the ocean, the Indian Ocean, from Indonesia to West Asia, delivering aid, delivering medical supplies and so on. And America was watching this, and they were saying, man, this is a navy that it's good to have on your side. So they started off a dialogue on renewing a military cooperation agreement that formalized this relationship between India and the United States. And China got a bit taken aback by this. So what did they do? China acts only under serious influence, and this was serious influence. So China agreed to sign with India the first of a three-step procedure that was intended to formalize the border. So what China sought was the political parameters and guiding principles, and then there was to be one more step, of formalizing the sort of principles, and then finally the third step was to be the actual measurement and sort of delineation and delimitation of the land that was agreed to go to the other side. So China agreed as part of phase 1 that the boundary should follow, and this is a direct quote from the thing, easily identified geographical features and safeguard due interests of settled populations in the border area. And what India got up and said was, well, the residents of Tawang are very well settled, and this means that we have got our way on Tawang. But China quickly sort of rebutted their stance on this entire thing and said that no, this does not mean that Tawang is yours. It means that the due interests of settled populations in the border areas should be taken into account. Why are you taking that forward and reading meanings into it? And they could also have said that the people of Tawang will be better looked after under you than under us. But fortunately, that it didn't come to that. Next. So then there were 2 more agreements that were signed, 3 earlier, 2 more, one of January 2012 and the next one, the Border Peace and Border Defense Cooperation Agreement on October 2013. So we have the network of agreements in place, except that this whole thing held up for some time and then fell apart. Next, please. The first thing to happen was a bit of a clash in the Daulat Beg Goldi place area, and one in Demchok in 2012 and 2013. And you know, it sort of vitiated the atmosphere for a little while, but things went back to business as usual. And then in 2017 came that Doklam incident that every one of you would be knowing about very well. And sort of it sort of became clear that relations were going bad to us. Then came that Kashmir sort of rearrangement of political sort of powers, the sort of formulation of Union Territory of Ladakh and a Union Territory of Kashmir. And the Chinese, of course, got up and said, you know, why are you for making a Union Territory out of a place that belongs to us, which is Ladakh? So it didn't work out very well. Amit Shah got up in Parliament and said, we are going to get back Pakistan occupied Kashmir and we are going to get back Aksai Chin. And the Chinese are understandably not pleased about this. So the result was 2 sort of major things. One was Doklam and the other was the 2020 invasion, almost I would call it, of this area. Next, please. So these are the sort of various points at which the Chinese came in. It all began in May 5th in the Galwan Valley. They came, there was always that patrol crossing one another, which I told you about. But this time they came in brigade strength. A brigade is 3 battalions. 3 battalions is close to 3,000 people. In the Chinese case, it's a little less. But we suddenly found that the Indian Army was operating under COVID restrictions, and the Chinese were sitting there and walking into our territory. So May 5th, they occupied Galwan and Hot Springs. Mid-May, it was Chushul. May 17th, Pangongso. And June 2nd week, Depsang. Depsang, they are still sitting over there, a good 15 kilometers inside what we claim to be our territory, and making no move to get out. Okay, so I don't think there's a file that we need to see after this. Can you just check the? Yeah, okay. So these were the satellite images that we sort of accessed at that time. We were getting it from commercial satellite. This thing who did brisk business at the cost of sort of Times Now and other agencies like that. But there were armored personnel carriers and trucks, self-propelled artillery. Look at the sort of size of the encampments. This was the Chinese in 2020. Next. This is the Galwan River as it flows into the Shyok. This goes out. This is somewhere near the border where sort of patrols go for that mutual patrol drill. It's called PP-14, and they came in from here. They occupied these heights around, and at the estuary over here, they were sort of dominating the estuary, and India had built a road here, which could no longer be used. Next. This too is the Galwan area, and sort of earlier the boundary used to be over here. Now you have Chinese defensive positions well forward over here. This used to be Indian territory, Indian claimed territory, I should be correct, and this is still not with India now. Next. This was the Pangong Lake area where again China sort of came in, occupied the heights, and then did a sort of very cheaty kind of settlement in which they created a buffer zone that was entirely on Indian territory. So just quickly run over what happened. May 5th, first clear incursions in Galwan, and simultaneously the PLA crossed the LAC at two other points. All this while the Indian army was in permanent locations or in other locations where they were not in a position to influence the outcomes that were being made. Second PLA ingress 2000 kilometers away at Nakula in Sikkim. Sorry, I forgot to mention that. The PLA also came into Sikkim, which is a bit, dodgy by any standards, because that was one of the places where it was the only place where the frontier between India and China was agreed. But they violated that as well. Third Pango, and in May 17th, 18th, Chinese troops seized up to up to Finger 8. Indians were beaten up. First sign of unusually violent conduct. This was no friendly troop sort of flag unfurling and biscuit exchanging. This was the real stuff. The Chinese were not hesitating to sort of attack Indians who were sort of who they felt were in disputed territory or so on. It was one of the things that characterized this, and one of the things that perhaps has changed forever. In mid-May, opposite Demchok, but this was a temporary phase. The Indian army is sort of pretty resilient in sort of reacting to situations, and before the Chinese could consolidate in a very major way, there were two divisions of Indian troops that were pumped in over there and who are still there. And the Chinese are now, at least, having already made their point, they are not in the position to make their point any further. So the incident of June 15th was tragic. There is no question about it. Indian verification mission under a colonel was sort of attacked. 20 people killed. Chinese casualties unknown. Indian sources were leaking 43 people killed. The Chinese said 4 people were killed. So there's no sort of meeting ground over there. What sort of effectively happened? Well, China had taken measures to protect what it calls its tactical vulnerabilities in Aksai Chin, in that road to or approach to Highway G219. By trespassing across the border at multiple points, China has effectively shifted the line of actual control yet again towards India, which PLA controlling key points. There's probably, and this is a friend of mine who sort of does satellite imagery, he says there's probably a brigade group at each place. in Demchok, Galwan, Hot Springs, and Pangong. So the intention to stay is quite evident. So furthermore, the August 5th change of Kashmir status and Amit Shah's threats to recover Indian territory underlined the common interests of Pakistan and China in that area. Extending China's influence to the Shok Valley allows for a joint action between China and Pakistan, with Chinese troops coming down the Galwan and Shok Valley and then going up to the Gilgit area, where they would link up with Pakistani troops. So this is sort of serious stuff. It's not just a sort of a couple of kilometers that they've occupied. If you connect the points that they've reached and draw a line, and then take a look at the line that they were previously at, the Chinese are estimated to have taken about 1,000 square kilometers of Indian territory. We've blocked Chinese firms from FDI in sort of in the rollout of 5G, but that's sort of not really going to hurt them. Everyone's blocked them anyway. So what was sort of remarkable was the Indian government's sort of soft peddling and trying to put out things that were saying China has not entered our territory. The Prime Minister himself, after all parties meeting on June 20th, I think it was, came out and said, "Na koi ghusa hai, na koi ghusa hua hai." I don't know what convoluted statement he made, which basically implied that there are no Chinese and there never have been any Chinese in Indian territory. This didn't look at all good when, the next day China returned 20 prisoners that they had taken, 10 prisoners they had taken. So, the situation that prevails now is that China and the government's positions are the same, which is that no Chinese are in Indian territory. But the difference is the Chinese says no Chinese are in Indian territory because they claim all the territory that they're there. India claims the territory, but China is still there. But we're making the same statement as the Chinese. So it's not a very sort of coherent bargaining position that we have. Over a large number of meetings, Modi probably misunderstood Xi Jinping. He sort of seems to have come to the conclusion that Xi Jinping was this cuddly guy who wants friendship between India and China. The Chinese premier has understood Modi perfectly. His political formula of muscular Hinduism, it does not allow for admitting to a sort of setback in any case. So Modi cannot sort of admit the setback, but if he sort of says what he's saying, then he's in alignment with China. So it's not a happy situation either on the ground or in the bargaining tables. Let's see where we can go. Okay, I think I'll leave it here. This is the broad position and how it has come to pass in this manner, and where we stand today with China.